Louise Harrington, director of admissions at Columbia University, prepares for work. She eats lunch with her ex-husband Peter, whom she stays close friends with. After wrapping up with work, Louise finds an envelope from someone named Scott Feinstadt. Louise opens it up to find his application form. She contacts Scott to offer him an interview, visibly looking nervous and hesitant. Scott accepts it, and they schedule the interview for Monday. Over the weekend, Louise visits her mom, Ellie. Louise looks annoyed when Ellie mentions her brother, Sammy, is coming over, then retires to her room. When Ellie asks how Peter is doing, Louise reminds her that she and Peter are divorced. Louise looks through a box of her old things, holding a name tag with Scott's name on it, her high school sweetheart. She reminisces old memories, looking at a drawn picture of him. Louise returns downstairs to see Sammy has arrived, and she asks her mom about the Feinstadt family. Ellie informs her that Scott didn't have other distant relatives and sadly talks about his passing. On the day of the interview, Louise nervously waits for Scott to arrive. While waiting, she calls her best friend Missy to ask if past Scott had ever used a phrase that present Scott added to his letter. Missy tells her that past Scott used to say it often and mentions him always being late with a grin on his face. Louise thanks Missy and continues to wait for Scott, who suddenly arrives, grinning at her. Louise looks at him nostalgically as Scott bears similar qualities as her high school sweetheart. Scott prepares his slides to present to Louise, and there's a knock on the door. Peter asks her if he can come over tonight, and Louise allows him and returns to Scott. She looks through Scott's slides and is amazed by his work. Louise assures him that his work looks promising and he has a chance of getting accepted, and Scott hurries to leave without asking questions about the program. Louise chases after him, shocked at him running off. She offers to tell Scott about the program and the university, trying to convince him to stay. Scott looks at her confused but accepts Louise's offer. They arrive at Louise's place where they share a glass of wine. Scott asks Louise if anyone has done her portrait before and asks if he can do it for her. He grabs her hand and traces his finger up her arm, leading toward intimate areas of her torso and face. The two start sharing COVID on the couch, leading them to create a new virus together. After their lab experiment is finished, Scott asks if it'll affect his chances of getting accepted. Louise snaps back to reality and says she should return to the office, and Scott gets dressed. He asks if they can hang out later at night, but Scott suddenly changes his mind and offers to take her out on a date on another day. Scott uses Louise's phone to call his mom, telling her the interview went great. He ends the call as he's distracted by Louise changing in front of him and asks if he can take a shower. Before he heads to the bathroom, Louise makes him promise that she'll see him tomorrow night for their date. Louise returns to her office and looks at Scott's slides again when she receives a call from Missy. Missy gossips with her about a man she plans to use as an Uber, despite being married and having twins, but notices a change in Louise's voice. Missy notes that Louise's voice changes when she has gotten dirty exercise. She asks Louise who she did it with, and Louise only tells her she knows nothing. Later that night, Louise and Peter catch up with each other. Peter reveals that he met a woman through Sammy, who Peter asked for help from due to his dirty exercise addiction. Louise is shocked considering that they never did the deed during their marriage, and she realizes that Peter was getting it from somewhere else. Peter admits that he struggles with temptation each new semester when he gets a list of names, despite promising himself it won't happen again. Louise, in tears, reminds him that their relationship began when her name was on one of those lists. Peter assures her that she's different from the others. When Louise asks him how many he slept with during their marriage, Peter confesses there were hundreds of girls along with a few men. Louise cries in disbelief, and Peter defends himself, saying it's a disease and she just has to accept it. Well, well, well. Louise should be free to do whomever she pleases then. And who the heck is sleeping with Peter's rat-looking ass? He continues that he went to Sammy for help to get into a program that helps with addictions, which is where he met Farah, the woman he's been seeing. Peter confesses that he used to blame Louise for not catching on to his problems and kept seeing him as some perfect man. Louise scoffs when Peter tells her he's offering his true self after all these years and tells him to leave. The next day, Louise wallows in sadness as she cleans the house. She answers the door and Scott hugs her, wondering if she's crying about him. Louise tells him that she learned awful things about her ex-husband during their marriage, and Scott brushes it off as Peter being jealous. Scott expresses jealousy about Louise talking about her ex-husband and assures her that it's just him and her tonight. Louise and Scott share a romantic time on their date. A man playing billiards shouts at them to stop with the PDA, and Scott gets up to greet his friend, Ricky. Scott introduces Ricky and Louise to each other, and Ricky lightheartedly tells Louise not to trust Scott. When Louise asks Scott about it, he explains that he needed someone to cover up for him. Louise assumes he was with a girl, and Scott tells her it happened before the two of them met. He notices Louise's mood change and brings her to a secluded area. Scott plays a game with Louise and tries to guess what she's thinking about. He mentions a brown-haired woman who has twins and is named Missy, and Louise asks how he knows about her. Scott jokingly says that he knows everything about her and reveals that he spoke with Missy on the phone at her house thinking it was Louise. The couple returns home and they get intimate after Scott confronts Louise about Peter hurting her. The next morning, Louise wakes up, but Scott has already left. She visits her mother's home and cries to Ellie in her bed. Louise reveals that Peter has a girlfriend, and her mother comforts her. Sammy visits at night eating Ellie's pie, and Louise confronts him about Peter. Louise tells him that he could have told her about Peter's addiction, but Sammy says that Peter told him not to. The topic brings the siblings to a heated argument, and Louise leaves the house. She visits the hotel Missy is staying at, and Missy brings up Scott. When Louise asks her how she found out, Missy mentions that she called Louise's house after calling her in her office, and she and Scott talked for half an hour. Missy reveals that talking with Scott made her feel like her past self, not the present who's busy working and taking care of her 2 kids. She reveals that she met Ricky after finding Scott's mom in the phone book, since she stays at Ricky's place. Missy confesses she lied, saying she was from the university so she could talk with Scott in person. Missy says she invited Scott to brunch so she could tell him all about Louise. Louise asks her if she was with Scott today, and Missy agrees, expressing how much fun they had together. Louise wonders if Scott asked about her, and Missy tells her he was very curious. Missy assures her that she didn't mention the past Scott, and Louise asks how much progress she made with him. Missy replies that it wasn't enough, but she got to touch Scott. Louise is in disbelief, looking annoyed, and Missy brags about it. Louise excuses herself to the bathroom, smoking her cigarette and looking anxious. She finds Missy's phone book with a sticky note, with Ricky's name and number written on it. Louise puts it in her pocket just as Missy enters the bathroom. She complains about Louise gatekeeping Scott from her, and Louise bursts out, saying she refuses to share him with Missy for a second time. Missy argues that Scott broke up with Louise to be with her instead. But out of pity, Missy had decided to share him with Louise. She claims that Scott was hers when he passed away. But Louise doesn't care and says that Scott would have been with her if he hadn't died. Missy fights back that she and Scott would have married and had children together, saying Louise couldn't have because she isn't fit to be a mother. Louise feigns hurt, and Missy apologizes. Louise leaves in a fit, telling Missy that she'll reveal everything to Scott. Missy tells her she'll ruin everything, but Louise doesn't listen. Louise arrives at Scott's place, but he's already waiting for her outside. She asks if Missy told him anything, and Scott tells her that he's aware Louise has something to tell him. Scott bitterly mentions that Louise is tired of him and has had her fun. Louise struggles to get her words out, but eventually reveals that Missy stole her high school sweetheart from her. Louise confesses he passed from a car accident, and Scott has many similarities with him. Louise explains they share a love for art, their appearance, and their name. Scott clarifies if she and Missy think the past Scott has come back to life, and Louise agrees. Scott scoffs at it, but Louise stays delusional. He tells her that everyone experiences high school heartbreaks and it's normal, but Louise rolls her eyes and prepares to leave. Scott adds that when someone experiences something bad, they simply move on, but Louise argues against it. Scott tells Louise he doesn't want to fight and goes inside. Louise returns home and sadly looks at the painting that past Scott created for her. When she enters her bedroom, she finds Peter sitting in the dark and comforts him. In the morning, Scott appears at Louise's door. Scott freely enters but finds Peter on the couch. Louise lies that Scott is an applicant and he scoffs at her. Louise tells Peter to go home so she can handle it, but the men start bantering with each other. Louise interrupts them and escorts Peter out of her place. When he's gone, Scott bursts out, claiming that Louise is lying and is shameless for sleeping with her ex-husband. Louise clarifies that nothing happened last night, and the two argue about how everything is overwhelming. When Louise calls out for him, Scott laughs at the name. He confesses that his name isn't Scott, but Francis Scott, and admits that he thought F. Scott sounded cool on his application. Francis tells Louise that she never saw him as his own artist, but as an extension of Scott. He makes fun of the painting Scott made for her, saying that an immature teen kicked a can of paint and called it art. Louise chases after him as he leaves, and Francis mentions that he went to Missy last night after he couldn't sleep. He leaves Louise to assume what happened between them, and Louise slams the door behind him. Louise visits Missy and confronts her about what she did with Francis last night. Missy jokes that they exercised until the sun came up, but explains she gave him shots to drink. Missy confesses that she only wanted him because Louise had him, leaving Louise baffled. They talk about their argument the night before and the hurtful words they said to each other. Missy surrenders and says that Louise is wasting her time fighting with her when she could be fixing things with Francis. Time passes by and Louise visits Peter. Louise mentions that the two of them will never work regardless if they still love each other, and they both quietly agree. In the seminar room of the university, Francis's artworks are displayed on the big screen. She encounters him on campus and they have a private talk in her office. Louise hands him an envelope, smiling at him. Francis reads that he got accepted into the program, and Louise tells him that only his hard work got him in. Francis wholeheartedly thanks Louise, and they share a kiss outside. Hard work or hard wood? Girl, we know the truth. What did you guys think of this one?
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.